So much, Pastor Jared. We are ready to go here, I think, and it really is a privilege and pleasure to be with you this Sabbath afternoon. And really, it's quite remarkable when you think about it that we can meet in this capacity with the technology that's available to us, and that we can still meet as minds of God's people, thinking and studying together, even across many miles and so much distance. So we're going to be discussing a little bit further in our study this afternoon on the topic of personal finance, focusing particularly on that aspect of giving. And so I'm going to go ahead and get my screen shared with you, and then we'll have prayer, and then we will begin. So let me just get this shared with you now. All right, there we are. Let's bow our heads for prayer as we begin. Father in heaven, we thank you for your bountiful goodness to us, for the clarity in your word, and that your word, the Bible, is a practical book. It is a book with instruction for how to live our daily lives, and not merely the theoretical and the spiritual things that may sometimes seem detached from the day-to-day issues that we have to face. And Lord, as we continue on in this study, this afternoon and then later on this evening, I pray you will give us wisdom as we seek that wisdom from your word, which you have promised to give us. Please, may your spirit be with us now as we begin. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. So you see the title on the screen here, Laying Up Treasure, Earning Interest in the Bank of Heaven. So maybe I'll just summarize a little bit like this. When we talk about finances, we can sort of break down personal finance into different buckets. We have the earnings, how do we earn our money? And then there is the aspect of how do we spend our money? And then there's the aspect of how do we invest our money? And then there's also the idea of how do we handle giving our money away when it comes to things like charity and offerings and tithe and so forth. So since we are still in the Sabbath hours, and as people who really care deeply about God's counsel on stewardship, that's really the focus of our hour today right now. So we mentioned this last night, but I'll mention it again. If you are interested to see some of the details of our personal finance journey, my wife and I, we've written at savingthecrumbs.com. This is a personal finance blog, which sort of got me into the personal finance realm. And we have a lot of tidbits from our personal journey there. And also, if you want to hear the full series of all of the messages that I've given on the nuts and bolts of personal finance, you can check out audioverse.org and look up these two seminars, Beyond the Tithe and For the Love of Money, from GYC 2015 and 17. There are about 12 hours altogether of lectures that I've given that goes into a lot more detail. And however, some of the things I'm sharing today with you will actually be new. So it will still be good to pay attention. All right, so let's begin with the verse from which we derive the title of our seminar today. Matthew 6:19 through 21, Jesus speaking, he says, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." We've heard this before. We know Jesus has given us this admonition, but I want to pause a moment, just think a little bit about what he's actually saying. Jesus here says we ought to lay up for ourselves treasures in heaven. What does that mean? What are the treasures that we can lay up in heaven? I think for us, when we think of this passage, automatically we are inclined to think of it in a metaphorical or a spiritual sense. Treasure in heaven must be like, our affections, and, we'll be able to, spend time with Jesus, and there'll be, the spiritual blessings of being saved in the kingdom. That we generally sort of leave our understanding of treasure at that point. But is it possible that we are missing the forest for the trees, so to say? Like, are we missing the point of what Jesus might actually be saying? Because there's this next statement in the book Adventist Home that helps us frame this concept a little bit. Page 541. It says, a fear of making the future inheritance seem too material has led many to spiritualize away the very truths which lead us to look upon it as our home. It's easy, I think, for us to get into a position of over spiritualizing the promises of heaven and the future and all of those things, because we don't want to end up being greedy. We don't want it to make us seem like we are so materialistic, maybe. But the fact of the matter is, heaven is a real place. The New Jerusalem that we read about in the book of Revelation is a literal place with real streets made from real gold, and the gate is a real pearl, and the tree of life will bear real fruits that we can actually eat, and the water of life and the river of life, and we're going to have crowns there, we're told, and they will have stars on them. These are literal things. We will literally have mansions. When Jesus says, I go to prepare a place for you, in my Father's house are many mansions, we need to be careful not to over spiritualize the things that Jesus has promised us to make, to make us want and desire to live in heaven and in the new earth with him, and over spiritualize it to the point where it becomes meaningless. Okay. So when Jesus says, lay up your treasure in heaven, I want to suggest that it is, yes, a spiritual aspect, right? Being able to commune with our friends, the souls that we win, the character we develop, all of these good things, we will take those things to heaven, but there is a physical, material aspect of heaven as well. So taking this one step further, I want to take a look at some of these other statements. Or actually, let me back up. Before we get to the statements, what am I actually trying to say? It's true, the statement, you can't take it with you when you die, right? When we talk about material wealth, it's one of those things like, hey, don't be so greedy and hoard up all the earthly acquisitions that you can, because when you die, it's not going with you. However, what the Bible actually teaches is that you can send your treasure on ahead, because Jesus says, lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven. So even though you can't take it with you when you die, you can send it on ahead. So this is where the statements from the Spirit of Prophecy makes this even clearer. Testimonies for the Church, Volume 3, page 249. She writes, every opportunity to help a brother in need or to aid the cause of God in the spread of truth is a pearl that you can send beforehand and deposit in the bank of heaven for safekeeping. Again, I want us to think about this not just in a spiritual sense, because indeed we will have spiritual blessings. We can read it like, oh yeah, if we help a brother and we save the brother, he will be like a pearl, right? We'll have a soul that we have saved in heaven. That's spiritualizing the point a little bit beyond, I think, what is trying to be stated here. We're told there is a bank in heaven, and that when we do something for the cause of God, God on our behalf places a pearl into our account. Just like I think when we are little kids, our parents probably helped us open a bank account, and we don't earn any money, but our parents may on our behalf put some money in there, whether we did a chore, we helped someone, or we had a birthday, or we lost a tooth. I don't know what it might be, but our parents put money in the account on our behalf so that later on we have something. It's like that kind of picture of God putting something to our account. And it's interesting, we hear this phrase, the bank of heaven. It's going to come up again in the next passage. Review and Herald, July 1, 1890. It says this: the only safe place to deposit our treasures is in the bank of heaven. Every deposit made in this bank will accumulate abundant interest. You will be laying up in store for yourselves against the time to come. And I hope you see the similarity here of this passage with what Jesus said about laying up your treasure in heaven, right? It's very similar language here. What we see here is that Ellen White says there is a bank in heaven. And we might be thinking, now, why do they need a bank in heaven? Well, we believe that there is a sanctuary in heaven. We believe that there is a temple in heaven, and that it is a literal place with literal angels, and there is a literal judgment going on. We believe that there are literal physical type of, maybe they're not buildings in the sense that we think of them, but there are literal structures or institutions that are actually occurring in heaven. Why is it such a stretch for there to also be a bank? I actually think there is a bank in heaven. Now, what the bank is for, we're not totally sure, but we're told here that that is the only safe place to where to deposit our treasure. And how do we deposit it? Our treasure there? Well, the last passage, when we help the cause of God, help a brother in need, right? When we contribute to the advancement of God's kingdom, God makes deposits for us there. And this statement adds to that and says our deposits there will accumulate abundant interest. Now, how about that? There is a bank in heaven in which our investment is completely safe. Such a thing doesn't exist here on this earth. There is no perfect investment on earth, but there is a perfect investment in heaven. That is in the bank of heaven where God can make deposits on our behalf to our account, and it will accumulate abundant interest. So what's the only catch? The main catch is that we need to make sure that we are there to be able to make the withdrawal one day for ourselves in heaven. God has an account for us there already. He's planning on us being there. We just need to make sure that we will meet him there. And of course, this reminds us of the importance of laying up our treasure in the bank of heaven and doing our part to accomplish that. So this is quite a promise that I think we ought to bear in mind as we proceed to discuss this topic of our financial stewardship regarding giving back to God. But there's actually more to this idea that I want to drill down a little bit more. And this statement in Counsels on Stewardship, page 343, is instructive. It says, the Lord has made us as almoners. He places in our hands his gifts in order that we shall divide with those who are needy. So this is similar language to what we do to have a deposit, right, up in the bank of heaven. And it says here, it is this practical giving that will be to us a sure panacea for all selfishness. So what are we told here? That there is a remedy, there is a cure, there is a medicine that can cure us of our selfishness. Now, wouldn't we want that, right? Isn't selfishness sort of the whole problem with the problem of sin, right? Is we place ourselves in the center instead of God and others. And what we're told here is that this practical given, the using of our means for the advancement of God's work and to help those in need, can be this cure for selfishness. And Evangelism, page 633, tells us that selfishness is the root of all evil. And if this sounds familiar to you, it's because this is also reflected in 1 Timothy 6:10. We read this last night. For the love of money is the root of all evil. And what's another word for the love of money? The love of money merely is a manifestation, one of the clearest manifestations of selfishness. So put it another way, if we are ever going to have a victory over the sin of selfishness, this trait, this carnal trait of our fallen human nature of selfishness, somewhere along the way, we're going to have to get a grip on how we handle our money. Or put it another way, we're going to have to be able to manage our money in such a way that we advance God's work and are able to generously distribute the means to those who need it if we are ever going to have victory over our selfish nature. It is quite a deep connection if we really want to think about it that way. So this idea of our stewardship, of giving and our charitable activities and all of these things, it is a cure for selfishness. So the treasure that we place in heaven, it's not just a physical pearl, but it is also the development of our character and the overcoming of our sinful nature and victory over sin. It all has a part to play. All right, so let's get practical now. So we're talking about our stewardship, and this is about how do we give back to God the means that he's placed within our hands. And I want to read with you this passage. We're going to read it. I think it goes through a couple slides, and then we're going to summarize, okay, the main points afterwards. So Counsels on Stewardship, page 80. We're told, this matter of giving is not left to impulse. God has given us definite instruction in regard to it. He has specified tithes and offerings as the measure of our obligation, and he desires us to give regularly and systematically. Same page, same book. Let each regularly examine his income, which is all a blessing from God, and set apart the tithe as a separate fund to be sacredly the Lord's. This fund should not in any case be devoted to any other use. It is to be devoted solely to the support of the ministry of the gospel. After the tithe is set apart, let gifts and offerings be apportioned as God has prospered you. This passage we just read is just absolutely packed. Okay, so we're actually going to break this down piece by piece as we go through the rest of this study. But the outline, okay, how ought we to give? The outline from what we just read, I just want to break it down into 4 points. Number 1, we are not to give by impulse. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But we are also to give systematically. Now, what does that mean? Okay, we'll discuss that. And we are to set aside the tithe, which literally the definition of tithe means 10%. We are to set it aside as sacred from each paycheck or each income, whatever income we receive. And very interestingly, the last passage we just read says that the tithe is specifically for the support of the gospel ministry. And then the 4th point here, then we ought to give offerings as God has prospered. So for the rest of our time together in this hour, these 4 points is going to form the outline of everything we're going to discuss. Not to give by impulse, how to give systematically. We're going to discuss the tithe, and then we're going to discuss offerings. All right, so let's talk about what's the significance about not giving by impulse. Counsels on Stewardship, page 25 says this: selfishness, there's that word again, is the strongest and most general of human impulses. The struggle of the soul between sympathy and covetousness is an unequal contest. For while selfishness is the strongest passion, love and benevolence are too often the weakest. And as a rule, the evil gains the victory. Therefore, in our labors and gifts for God's cause, it is unsafe to be controlled by feeling or impulse. This is a very deep and important point. This is a snippet, a picture into our human nature. And what we're told is that our human nature is governed primarily by the passion of selfishness. That's the strongest passion. And generosity and mercy and benevolence and love and all these things are generally the weaker impulse. So if our gifts to God, our stewardship, is controlled by emotion or feeling or impulse, in general, what we're told is that covetousness and selfishness will generally be the overpowering impulse. Okay, so that is a big reason why we cannot be ruled by impulse. But let's continue reading. To give or to labor when our sympathies are moved, and to withhold our gifts or service when the emotions are not stirred, is an unwise and dangerous course. If we are controlled by impulse or mere human sympathy, then a few instances where our efforts for others are repaid with ingratitude, or where our gifts are abused or squandered, will be sufficient to freeze up the springs of beneficence. Christians should act from fixed principle, following the Savior's example of self-denial and self-sacrifice. I think this passage always convicts me a little bit, because how often have I felt like, oh, I'm not going to donate to this ministry anymore because, they didn't, they were rude to me, or they didn't say hi when when we ran into each other, the leaders did, or sometimes, I don't want to give offerings to that church anymore because, the pastor said something that offended me, or the elder or something to that effect. That's a problem, because we're governed in this case by our emotions, and it is an unwise and dangerous course, is what we're told. Moreover, haven't we ever been in that situation where we see this tear-jerking testimony, or we hear a testimony like that, or this promo video for some, foreign missions or something that is just so emotional, And then we feel like, just take all my money, help the starving children. And we write the big check and we drop it in the plate, but then we hadn't thought through it. It's based on impulse and it was reactionary. And we didn't really plan properly. And then we end up regretting it later. And then we feel like, okay, maybe I can't be as generous in the future. These types of things are what happens when we are motivated by emotion or by impulse. What we are told, the better way is to act from fixed principle. Okay, so to give in a systematic way, which is actually the next point of where we're going. So I think an important point for us to remember is that our tithes and our offerings, when we return them to the Lord, they aren't payment for goods and services that we receive. Because here, particularly in the United States and Western culture, we have a consumer mindset where we feel like if we give money, we are entitled to a certain level of customer service, a certain, white glove service. And so sometimes we feel as though as consumers, we can treat God and the church in the same way. So, I hope this doesn't reflect on any of us, but I certainly am aware of individuals who try to use their tithes and offerings as leverage to get what they want from maybe the church board, or the pastor, or even the conference sometimes. And this is not appropriate, because tithes and offerings is not a business with a customer client type of relationship. We are stewards of these means that God has given to us. So what does it mean to give systematically? I mentioned this a few moments ago. If we are not to give by impulse or emotion, the way to guard against the human nature of being selfish and being sporadic or being undisciplined is to have a plan. And that's essentially what systematic means. Back in the early days of the Adventist movement, there was this idea termed Sister Betsy. It was introduced to promote this idea of systematic benevolence. You see, when the church was just started, there were ministers who had to get second jobs. They had, other careers, and they couldn't devote their full time to the ministry. And so the church realized we need to have a way of supporting our clergymen. And systematic benevolence was the proposal. It was the idea, and it was actually based on biblical principle. And essentially what it means is make a giving plan and stick with it. That's basically what systematic benevolence means in a nutshell. But breaking it down some more, systematic benevolence means to give in regular intervals, not just intermittently whenever we feel like it, whenever we remember, but in regular defined times. And generally this corresponds with our pay periods. We ought to give consistently. So again, not emotionally, not when we're, when we are, elated, the pastor gave a really good sermon, we're going to donate or give an offering check. But then when we feel depressed, then we're not, we don't want to go down that road. We ought to give a predetermined amount. And so this can then be worked into our household budget, and it can be proportional, right? Depending on who's able to give what is going to be ultimately something that is determined by how much we have in income and things of that nature. We ought to make it a priority, just like Paul recommended on the first day of the week, put aside, your offering money for the next Sabbath, right? So make it a priority, and we'll talk more about how to do that later on in this presentation. And systematic benevolence, I'm going to reiterate this point as we go along. It is not just referring to tithe, it also refers to offerings as well. And there are reasons for that, which we'll get into in just a moment. Malachi 3 verse 8 says, will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me. But you say, wherein have we robbed thee? Well, in tithes and offerings. So both tithes and offerings are expected. And if we shortchange God in one or the other, or both, we are robbing him. So systematic benevolence is our safeguard against the temptation to shortchange God and in turn robbing him. So we've talked about not giving by impulse or emotion. We've talked about what systematic benevolence is. Let's talk a little bit about the tithe now. We've all heard the term, but let's drill down just a little bit. This is not going to be an exhaustive study on tithe, but just covering some of the high points. The tithe is something special. And the tithe, why is it special? Well, a couple things. First, the word tithe literally means 10%. But it's not just any 10%. It should be the first 10%. And you might be thinking, what do you mean by first 10%? Isn't money fungible? Like $10 here, $10 in one hand, $10 in the other. Like if I switch it up and I go to the store, it doesn't really make a difference, right? Well, think of it this way. People often ask the question, should I return tithe on the gross income or the net income? I think many of us have heard this question before. And, I don't want to get too sophisticated in my answer because you can get kind of technical, especially if people are self-employed, they have business income and deductions and, all these types of things. But when we think of it simply this way, that the tithe ought to be the first 10%, then we just say, okay, so who comes first? Does God come first or does Uncle Sam come first? All of a sudden, the answer becomes a little bit easier to unravel. At least to me, it does. And also, does God come first or do I come first, right? Because we can also have this idea like, I'll spend all my money for all my necessities, and then whatever's left, if there's 10%, then God can have that. No, that's not the way we ought to think about this. God gets the first 10%. And the way I calculate in my home, the 10% comes out first, and then Uncle Sam gets his piece. Okay, and then all of my savings and my spending comes after that. So I used this example last night, but in case you weren't here, I'll restate it here. And that is that the tithe is like the dividend that gets returned to the owner of a business. We, in our personal lives, we have the enterprise of our life. We are the CEO, we are the manager, we are the steward, but God owns everything. And just like business owners gets a dividend that's returned to them from the profits, God gets the dividend. But the dividend simply represents that he owns the whole business, right? And so that means we don't get to decide what to do with the tithe. God, since he is the owner, it's his dividend, it's his business, he gets to decide what the tithe is used for. Which leads us to this next point. The tithe is special because God set the tithe apart specifically for the support of the gospel. So it's important for us to remember that the tithe is different than offerings in this way. We'll talk about offerings and what it is applied for in just a moment, but the tithe is very specific that it is for the support of the gospel. And so it's not for us to give to, any old charity, to the food bank or the soup kitchen or, different things that may be good, that might be fantastic ministries and things that help a lot of people. But God, because the tithe belongs to him, has specifically set the tithe apart for the ministry of the gospel. And this last point is also crucial to remember, and that is that the tithe is an integral part to the worldwide mission of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we are not a congregationalist denomination. We are a worldwide organization with a worldwide denomination with an organization that is a structure that holds everything together. And so the tithe that we return in the offering plate, or digitally if we do it online, to the local church, it doesn't stay at the local church. The tithe filters up to the conference where the majority of it remains, but then a portion goes to the union and then to the division or the general conference, and then it gets distributed back down through various mission initiatives and different things for the work of the gospel around the world. And so in a very important sense, the tithe ties us together as a global church community. And so when we have this mindset of, okay, I'm going to withhold my tithe because of this, that, or the other reason, we are actually saying we are not interested in participating in this capacity with the worldwide mission of the church. And also sometimes when we hear the ideas like, oh, with the tithe should just stay at the local church or it should stay at the local conference, we're making a statement that we don't really want to contribute to the worldwide mission of the church. And biblically speaking, right, we have been given the three angels' message. These angels fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. And the church is the agency that God has established on the earth to accomplish this. And so even though we might be lay people and we're not employed by the church, our interest ought to be closely aligned with the mission of the Seventh-day Adventist movement. And returning our tithe to the Lord is one very tangible, concrete, practical way that we can play an important part in that mission. And so even if perhaps something might not be up to our satisfaction in our conference or our division or union or local church or whatever, we need to remember the world church is bigger than just one person or one conference or one church or even one region. And we can still play a part in supporting the mission that's going everywhere in the world. And this just reminds me of the story of the widow's two mites, because frequently I know I've talked with many people who feel concerned about returning tithes to a church where perhaps they feel the mission is being undermined, or things are being taught that they don't approve of, or individuals are being on the church payroll that is, perhaps teaching error. There's all sorts of discomfort. But I want to remind you of the story of the widow and her two mites. Jesus, seeing all the people clunking their, heavy bags of cash into the treasury, and they feel like they're high and mighty. And then the widow comes with her two little pennies and quietly drops them in. It was everything she had, and she tries to shuffle away without anyone noticing her. And Jesus points her out and says, this woman has given more than all of these other rich guys. But where did she put that money? Her two mites went to the same treasury that paid the priests who later on would conspire to kill Jesus. In fact, 30 pieces of silver came out of that same treasury to Judas to betray him. So you see, Jesus here in this story illustrates that the widow's act of returning her tithe and offerings to God did not make her a culpable, did not make her culpable to the crimes and the misdeeds that would later be perpetrated from the money in that treasury. So yes, there might be issues in the church. The church is full of sinners and certainly are comprised of fallen humans. It's like the ark, right? You want to be on the ark, but it doesn't mean the ark is going to smell like a bed of roses. There are going to be problems. And God says your responsibility is not to fix all the problems, although if you can, you should do your part. Your responsibility is to follow God's stated will. And when it comes to the tithe, God's will is very clear. We don't want to be robbers of God. And to make this point even clearer, there's this statement from Testimonies for the Church, Volume 9, page 249. Ellen White writes this counsel: some have been dissatisfied and have said, I will no longer pay my tithe, for I have no confidence in the way things are managed at the heart of the work. But will you rob God because you think the management of the work is not right? Make your complaint plainly and openly in the right spirit to the proper ones. Send in your petitions for things to be adjusted and set in order, but do not withdraw from the work of God and prove unfaithful because others are not doing right. This statement is very clear. Two wrongs don't make a right. Just because someone is doing something inappropriate does not mean give us license to rob God. That's basically what she's saying. So I highly encourage every one of us to think and pray deeply about these things and to trust in the Lord to make things right in the church, even if we might feel certain things are not up to our satisfaction. Do what is counseled here. Make your complaint plainly and openly in the right spirit, very important, in the right spirit to the right people. Send in the petitions, try to do your part, make your voice be heard respectfully, but don't make that a reason to withdraw from our stated responsibility of returning a faithful tithe to the Lord. All right. And this is the promise. So those are sort of the dealing with some of the concerns that I've heard from many people, but here's the promise. Malachi 3 verse 10, bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in my house, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts. God here is actually saying, this is a test. Test me here and see if I will not open to you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing that there shall be no room or not room enough to receive it. God is saying, you can hold me to my word on this one. See if I am not a God in heaven who will pour out the blessings. And, when my parents, give you a little story to illustrate this. I immigrated to the United States when I was 6 years old with my parents from Hong Kong. And my mom was a nurse, so she had a job in the hospital. My dad had a career change, and he went back to school when we moved here. And my parents believed in Christian education, so they put us in church school, which is not public school, which means it costs money. And so we were really scraping the bottom of the barrel when it comes to our family budget. We were struggling as immigrants and with the church school budget, and then one income coming in, and my dad was going to school, so we had to pay for that too. So my parents during that time, this is what they told me, they felt like they could not afford to return a faithful tithe. And so they didn't for a while. But as they began to study and they were praying about these things, they felt convicted that they just couldn't rob God. They had to be faithful to what God had asked them to do. And so they said, we don't know how we can make the math work. We don't know how this is going to work, but we're going to be faithful and trust God and prove him and return our tithe to him. And so they did that. And the very first month, once they started doing that, my mom got a raise, just not unexpectedly. Oh, wow, we're earning more money. And then to top it off, the landlord, the lady whom we rented our house from, came and lowered the rent to our house that we were renting. When has that ever happened before? Nobody lowers the rent out of the blue. And so by being faithful to God, God turned around and said, now you give me permission to open the windows of heaven, and I'm going to pour out a blessing that you won't even know, how to take care, how to keep up with all of it. And that's exactly what happened. And from that day forward, my parents have never been slack when it comes to tithing again. And they have instilled within us the importance of doing that. And I praise the Lord for that. And that experience was all it needed for them to realize there is a God in heaven, and he will be faithful if we are faithful to him. So we've talked about tithe. Now, what about offerings? We usually talk about tithing when we talk about stewardship, but offering, as I've mentioned a few times, is really not an optional thing. It's still part of what God said, that how we can rob him. But practically speaking, what are the offerings? In short, everything that's not tithe is lumped into this category of offerings. So as far as the church goes, when we go to church, I should have brought it with me, but you know what a tithe envelope looks like. The tithe envelope, there's one line for tithe as the top, but then everything else underneath are offerings. That's basically the way you can break down the tithe envelope. There's a tithe, and then offerings is everything else. But the offerings is the portion of our giving that helps to fund our local church. The tithe money cannot go to pay for the electricity bill. It doesn't pay for the internet costs. It doesn't pay for the Sabbath school and the building expenses and keeping up the lawn and things of that nature. That comes from the offerings. And so everything underneath tithe on the tithe envelope, like the church budget, the Sabbath school budget, a building fund, worthy student fund, all of these types of things, that's the offerings. And also, if we ever give to supporting ministries outside of the church denomination, that also ought to come out of offerings and not from our tithe. But it is up to the giver's discretion as far as how we divvy up where our offering money goes. So there is discretion here. It is not as strictly demarcated as the tithe money. However, as I mentioned before, it is still not an optional thing. God can't, it's not, oh, I don't have to give offerings because it's optional. No, there is discretion in where we apply our offering funds, but it's not optional as far as God is concerned. So the question is, how much is appropriate to give as far as offerings go? We know that tithe is 10%. We've talked about that. And offerings, we read in a statement before, offerings is as God has prospered. And it comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 2. This passage says, upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store as God has prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. It's interesting. This passage is frequently used to support the idea of Sunday sacredness, because they say, see, Paul is saying that you take up the offering on the first day of the week. Actually, this verse is one of the best verses to support the importance of the seventh day Sabbath, because what Paul is actually saying is on the first day of the week, right after the Sabbath has passed, go ahead and put aside your offering for the following Sabbath, so that when I come, all the money is already put aside. You see, no gatherings when I come, meaning next Sabbath, we're not fumbling around, the couch cushions to look for the dollar bills to put in the offering plate. You've already set that money aside because God comes first. And so this point, that's one part of this passage, but this passage also talks about as God has prospered him. So that's the question now, because offerings are defined, or the quantity, how much we give in offerings, is defined by how God has prospered us. So what does that mean, as God has prospered us? Generally, we assume that means just if we have more money, if God blesses us with greater income, then we have to give more in offerings. I think that certainly plays a part in this calculation, but is that all there is to it? So I want to take a look at this passage in the book Patriarchs and Prophets, page 527. Because it actually gives us something very specific. It says here, the contributions required of the Hebrews for religious and charitable purposes amounted to fully 1/4 of their income. So 1/4 of their income, what percentage is that? That's 25%. And let me pause a moment and just mention this. Sometimes when we look at the spirit of prophecy, at least for me, I say, Lord, can't you be a little bit specific? Like when I'm asking for God's will for my life, what should I do, for career? Should I move here? Should I accept this position or whatever it might be? Like, God, make your will clear to me. And God generally gives us principles that we have to think and study through and prayerfully, seek wisdom on. But when I read this the first time, I'm like, this can't possibly be. Like, can't you this one time, can't you just be more nebulous, like more general in your counsel? Why do you have to be so specific? 25%? This is crazy. And we look at this and we say, how is this even possible for the people to give 25% of their income? Well, that's exactly the question that Ellen White assumed would come, because look at the very next sentence. She says, so heavy a tax upon the resources of the people might be expected to reduce them to poverty. But on the contrary, the faithful observance of these regulations was one of the conditions of their prosperity. On condition of their obedience, God made them this promise: I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, and he shall not destroy the fruits of your ground, neither shall your vine cast her fruit before the time in the field, and all nations shall call you blessed, for ye shall be a delightsome land, saith the Lord of hosts. So this statement here tells us that the Hebrews, in their religious and charitable purposes, gave fully 25%. And that was one of the conditions of their prosperity. So the question is, how much did they give in offerings? We already know how much tithe equals. Tithe means 10%. So what did they give on top of the 10% for offerings? Well, simple math tells us that it is 15%. So you see the math here, 25% total, 10% for tithe, 25% for offerings. And when you read in the spirit of prophecy in different places, sometimes they talk about it as the second tithe. It's sometimes referred to it as a second tithe. There might even be reference to a third tithe, because there are other statements where Ellen White actually talks about 1/3 of their income. But to me, this statement is a little bit clearer in the Patriarchs and Prophets. But of course, the question also comes up. So this was an example, right? This is the Hebrews. This surely, it can't apply to us, because back then, their whole economic system revolved around their religious faith and the sanctuary. So 25%, that was their tax. Like, that was everything. But today we've got tax to our government, render unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's. And then we have offerings and tithes separate from that. So surely God cannot expect us to give 25% today. Let's take a look at this next page, the very same chapter, the next page in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 528. In the days of Israel, the tithe and free will offerings were needed to maintain the ordinances of divine service. Should the people of God give less in this age? The principle laid down by Christ is that our offerings to God should be, notice this phrase very carefully, in proportion to the light and privileges enjoyed. Unto whomsoever much is given, of him shall be much required. The work of the gospel, as it widens, requires greater provision to sustain it than was called for anciently, and this makes the law of tithes and offerings of even more urgent necessity now than under the Hebrew economy. So if we want to be very honest with ourselves, the spirit of prophecy actually says we ought to give more today than back then. But it's important to notice that the spirit of prophecy does not make this a ironclad, heavy-handed requirement. It is not written in the Ten Commandments. I don't want to give that impression. Ellen White, in the way that it is written here, gives us an appeal to come up higher. It is a soft sell to say, why not see if we can't be even more generous for the advancement of God's work? And this comes back to this idea of how God has prospered us. Because we read earlier that offerings are apportioned as God has prospered. What does that actually mean? To a certain degree, I think it can apply to the concept of when God blesses us with more material things, we have a greater obligation to give back, sure. But in this passage that we just read, it says our offerings to God should be in proportion to the light and privileges enjoyed. So as God has prospered us is actually in the sense of spiritual blessing, of light and privileges, as well as material blessings. And so just think with me for a moment on what generation in human history has God given the greatest light and the greatest privilege and the greatest knowledge and understanding of his will and of his truths? I think we know the answer to that. Those of us who live in the last days under the church of Laodicea and prophecy, we are rich and increased with goods. That's what we're told. And in a very real sense, we have been given more light and privileges than all previous generations. And so there is greater responsibility required of us because to whomsoever much is given, much is required. So when we think about the counsel of how much to give, this gives me a helpful yardstick, a benchmark by which to measure my own stewardship. And this is a promise that's given in Testimonies for the Church, Volume 3, page 408. It says, should all whom God has prospered with earth's riches carry out his plan by faithfully giving a tenth of all their increase, and should not withhold their trespass offerings or their thank offerings, the treasury would be constantly replenished. If systematic benevolence were universally adopted according to God's plan, and the tithing system carried out as faithfully by the wealthy as it is by the poorer classes, there would be no need of repeated and urgent calls for means at our large religious gatherings. Wow, what a promise. I'm sure all of the ministries, all of the treasury departments, and all of the conferences around the world would love to not ever have to do a fundraising appeal. I work for Audioverse, as you know, and we have to raise money as an organization. And that's one of the things that I'd like to do the least, because I'd rather be doing actual work instead of constantly asking people for their donations. But what we're told here is that if all of God's people were just systematic in their returning their tithe and offerings faithfully, the treasury would be constantly replenished. There would be no need for the call for offerings. And in fact, in sacred history, this is exactly what happened at the building of the sanctuary. Moses said, we're going to build the sanctuary to glorify God. And the people kept bringing their means until Moses says, stop, we have enough. Wouldn't that be amazing? Well, the promise is, if we are faithful, that can certainly be the case even in God's church today. But we need to remember that God owns the other 75% too. So yes, we've talked about 10% tithe, 15% offering, but the rest of the 75% still belongs to God because God is the owner of everything. We are simply his managers. So there are some helpful things for us to remember about this as well. Thoughts from the Mount of Blessings, page 99. I love this passage. The statement says, Jesus does not release us from the necessity of effort, but he teaches us that we are to make him first and last and best in everything. We are to engage in no business, follow no pursuit, seek no pleasure that would hinder the outworking of his righteousness in our character and life. Whatever we do is to be done heartily as unto the Lord. So I think this idea of making Jesus first, last, and best in everything gives us a helpful framework when we think about our obligation to him in our stewardship and management of his means. So how do we make Jesus our first, last, and best with our giving? So this is how I like to, this is a framework of how I like to think about our stewardship responsibilities. Number one, systematic giving. This means making Jesus first in our tithes and our offerings, aiming for 25% or more. So what some of you who were with us last night, you probably remember I shared a slide where I shared a little bit about our personal percentage breakdown of how our family handles our finances. And our giving category regularly exceeds 25%, 26, some years 28. That's probably close to where we are these days, 28, 29% or so. And this is the reason why. It's based on this principle. We make Jesus first. Before I pay Uncle Sam, before I pay my bills, before I put anything in savings or retirement or anything like that, 25% goes to God, 10% for tithes, 15% for offerings or thereabouts. But how do we make Jesus last? That's called surplus giving. So surplus giving means making Jesus last by giving him any surplus after all our needs are met. So if God has blessed us, and we talked about prosperity last night, just having what we need, having enough, that's the threshold, the biblical understanding of prosperity. Anything beyond that is surplus. So let's say we have children and we've saved up and we are saving regularly and we have a plan, financial plan, to save regularly to be able to provide for their college. And we're taken care of for our retirement plans, and we've bought a house and we paid it off, and we have extra. Where should the extra go? Well, the extra goes back to Jesus, because that's how we remind ourselves that he is the owner of everything. And then how do we make Jesus best in everything? This is what I call sacrificial giving. We make Jesus best by being ready to give any and all if he asks. And this is an important point. We frequently, as Adventists thinking about the end times, we understand that someday we will have to sell everything for the sake of God before the second coming. And we say, oh yeah, I'm ready for that. I can do that. I'm definitely going to be faithful to God when we do that. But remember the rich young ruler? The rich young ruler thought he kept all of God's commandments. He thought he was ready to be translated. He thought he was doing so great. But when Jesus asked him to sell everything, he went away very sorrowful because he was very rich. He was unwilling when the rubber met the road, when the time came, when Jesus gave him the call to give everything, he wasn't willing to do it. And so I think for us today, we are fooling ourselves if we are struggling to even be faithful with the first 10%, if we think we're really ready to give God 100%. It's a muscle, this charitable giving thing, this generosity and this systematic benevolence is like a muscle. We have to actually exercise it, or else it atrophies and we're not able to actually do the lift, right, when the time comes to do it. And sacrificial giving may not be that Jesus comes to us and says, okay, now you need to sell everything. Maybe it is. I know I have friends who have done that, and they're now foreign missionaries giving their all for God. But maybe it might be something a little bit smaller than that. It could be a specific purchase that we have been planning for, and God says, do you really need that? I would like you to give that to me. Maybe to advance a special project. Maybe it's something going on at your local church, or evangelism, or a building project, or sponsoring someone to go to school. It could be something like that. Or maybe it's a vacation that God says, you know what, do you really need to go on a vacation right now? Maybe this money can be better used for this other service over here. this is going to be an individual thing. And certainly I am not here to tell you what to do with your money, but I am here to tell you that if Jesus makes a request for you, you better listen to him. Sacrificial giving means Jesus is going to have the best place in my heart, and whatever it is that he asks, I'm going to be willing to do it. And so summarizing really what we've talked about today, giving broken down into 3 steps. Number 1 is systematic giving. So the 3 S's: systematic giving, surplus giving, sacrificial giving. Systematic giving is our tithes and our offerings, aiming for 25% or more. And this is systematic benevolence. So regularly, not by emotion, having a plan, being diligent about it regularly. Surplus giving is realizing, recognizing what need we have, and to not continue to hoard up more than we need after we have our needs, and to be willing to pour that back into God's treasury for his work. And the sacrificial giving is this mindset of being willing to give Jesus whatever he asks, whenever he asks it. And so if we have that attitude, when it does come time at the end of all things to sell everything we have, we would have already been used to it, to practice that muscle. So the passage we started with this afternoon, Matthew 6, verse 20, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. Remember, God will put a pearl in our bank account in heaven as we are faithful to contribute to his work. And Review and Herald, July 1, 1890, the only safe place to deposit our treasures is in the bank of heaven. Every deposit made in this bank will accumulate abundant interest. What a promise. And I want to make sure I am there to get the checkbook, right, that God is keeping on my behalf. I want that checkbook. And Counsels on Stewardship, page 343. It is this practical giving that will be to us a panacea, a cure, a remedy for all selfishness. It has something to do with my sanctification experience, how I handle God's money. And so I pray that we will be laying up our treasure in heaven, and that we will be earning abundant interest there together, and that we might be able to withdraw from our bank account there someday soon when Jesus comes to take us. So I will conclude my slide sharing here, and let's bow our heads for prayer as we end. Father in heaven, we thank you for your amazing grace and for the clarity of your word. And we even thank you for the challenge that it offers to us. Lord, we are called to a life of greater sacrifice. And when we look at the cross of Calvary, when we see what Jesus has given to us, or given of himself for us, Lord, there is nothing we can do to match that priceless gift. And so as we do our part to simply obey the counsel you have given, to be faithful in returning our tithes and our offerings, to not be governed by impulse and selfishness, but to be systematic and to be regular and to be consistent in our giving, and to be willing to give you the best place in our lives, and to manage our financial affairs so that you come first and last and best. We pray that you will give us that strength, that you will multiply our loaves and our fishes, that you will help us to be content with what you have given, and for us to be able to live in such a way that someday soon we will be able to see souls in heaven because of the work and the sacrifice we commit for you. And so I pray you will guide us the remainder of this Sabbath and help us to be ready for your soon return. And also may you bring us safely back together for the next hour of our session later this evening. We thank you and we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Al. Appreciate that. I trust everybody was blessed and challenged like I was. I want to remind everybody we have another session tonight at 6:30. Al, can you remind us your topic for 6:30?
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up because we will also have a question and answer session. But the topic specifically is slaves with smallpox, dealing with debt. So we're going to be talking about debt in all of its various flavors. We'll be talking about what is acceptable debt, what is not, how do we know. We'll talk about student loans. We'll talk about how to buy a car. We'll talk about my story of how we bought a house and how we can move out in the country without breaking the bank. a lot of practical stuff. We'll talk about credit cards, how to get out of debt. Yeah, we're going to be covering a lot of stuff, very practical. And then right after that session, we will have an open forum where you can ask me any questions. Really, I assume it'll be primarily personal finance questions, but we can also discuss other things as well, I suppose. So if you have questions, make sure to jot them down, have them ready, and we will try to get through as many of them as we can.
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate that. So yes, everybody, remember to join back in at 6:30 and tell a friend, text a friend to join. I've been really blessed by this, and I trust everybody else has too. Have a good rest of the Sabbath, and we'll see you all at 6:30.